and welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipsson. Today's guest is Dan Abrams. He's a sports psychologist and owner of Dan Abrams Sport Psychology. Dan is working alongside individuals, teams, coaches, and organizations globally. He's known for his passion to demystify sports psychology and for creating simple-to-use performance techniques. He is also the author of 4 best-selling sports psychology books and is the founder of Dan Abrams Soccer Academy, as well as his own podcast, the Sport Psych Show. Moreover, Dan is a former PGA qualified professional golfer, and he holds a first-class honors degree in psychology and a master's degree in sports psychology. Dan Abrams, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
Hey Marcus, I'm absolutely honoured to be asked on and to be with you this evening. Thanks for inviting me.
Pleasure to have you on. You are the owner of Dan Abrams Sport Psychology Ltd, and you're a sports psychologist working with the athletes and teams. So could you just explain a little bit what you do and maybe tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. Well, as you've mentioned, I'm a sports psychologist. I have been for the last 15 years. Prior to that, I was involved with professional golf. I left school and became a professional golfer. So I played for several years, realized pretty quickly I was probably going to be poor for the rest of my life if I continued down that path. So opted to coach. I did my PGA, my Professional Golfers Association badges, if you like, and I became a golf coach. And I always had a passion for sports psychology when I was a player. I saw some sports psychologists to varying success. And as I started coaching the game of golf, I think my interest in sports psychology increased. And I decided to go to university at that time. It was sort of my mid-20s, go to university and do a degree in psychology. And then I did a master's in sports psychology and really came to a crossroads. Do I carry on being a golf coach and have the qualifications as a side thing? Or do I walk away from the golf, step back and go and become a full-time sports psychologist? And I chose the latter because I love golf, but I wanted to work in a number of sports, in a number of domains. And so I chose to become a full-time, fully registered sports psychologist. That was 15 years ago. So I've been involved in high-performance sport, I suppose, for around about 22 years. And I've been a sports psychologist for 15 years. And I've been grateful to work primarily in golf and football, soccer. I've been lead psychologist for England golf between 2013 and 16. I was lead psychologist for England rugby 2017 to 18. And I've worked across sports, Marcus, you do as a sports psychologist. I've worked in a number of sports and Olympians and tennis players, et cetera, et cetera. But I, as I say, lots in golf and a lot in football. So I've worked with a number of Premier League teams, have been blessed to work with a number of top coaches, managers, players, and written 4 books, 3 soccer psychology books, 1 golf one. I have my own podcast, the Sport Psych Show. And so, yeah, I think that gives you a bit of a background there.
Yeah, definitely. Wow, what a resume. So if we're bouncing back a little bit, you mentioned that you have a degree in psychology and a master's in sports psychology. So did you know from a young age that this was the path you wanted to take?
I was reading sports psychology books from a surprisingly young age, and when I say surprising, I'm not saying 6 years old or anything like that. But I was in my mid-teens when I picked up a book called The Inner Game of Golf, which was by a guy called Timothy Galway, who's become globally quite famous for his Inner Game series of books. Inner Game of Golf was his second one after the initial Inner Game of Tennis. And as I say, I was about 15 and probably when I should have been chasing girls, I was reading sports psychology books, which I look back at that and sort of, yeah. And as I look back at that as a psychologist and sort of ask myself serious questions. When I finished school and I became a pro golfer, I picked up another very influential book for me and influential in the world of sports psychology, a book by Dr. Bob Rotella. And it was a book called Golf is Not a Game of Perfect. I'm just going to have a sip of water. It's the pressure, you see, Marcus. It's the pressure on being on a globally leading podcast.
On being on the other side of the mic for once.
Yeah. And so, and that was a wonderful book still is, and because I think really in many respects he was the first mainstream sports psychologist. You know, he was head of sports psychology at Virginia University, and he was the first mainstream sports psychologist to come along and write a book that really didn't talk about any psychological theory. So he didn't throw complex terms at anybody, and he obviously got permission from some of his golfing clients to talk a little bit about the work he'd done with them. And it's a wonderful, wonderful book, really breaking it down and made a big difference in, I mean, golf has always been seen as psychological, I suppose. But I think it was the book that came along that really boosted, you know, the notion that golf is very psychological and sport can be. So that's really where my interest was growing. And as I said earlier, I saw a sports psychologist as a player, and I was going to conventions and you know, as a young golf coach, listening into sports psychologists speak. I don't know. I suppose, you know, I never, as I mentioned earlier, really, Marcus, I never really fully sort of thought I'm definitely going to be a sports psych right up until I finished my master's degree. And I was like, yeah, I'm going to push the golf aside, golf coaching, and do the sports psychology. So it started early, but it wasn't until I was in, you know, my later 20s, 15 years ago, that I went, yep, this is what I'm going to do.
Yeah, I see. So how was the transition? You mentioned that you were a golfer and maybe that you wouldn't be financially set from that career, and then decided to go into sports psychology. So how was the transition from being a player to being a sports psychologist?
Well, I mean, the gap was filled with coaching, which I think was really, really important for me. The transition was really important. So if we said I was a pro golfer and there was a transition of coaching and then I became the sports psychologist, those transition years were really important, because I just think as a sports psychologist, if you've got a playing background, a competitive background, that's really useful. If you've coached, wow, that really does make a difference. And golf is an intriguing one as a coach, because you know, so often as a sports coach, it's not full time. It's done on a wet Wednesday night for a couple of hours or a couple of nights a week, and that's it. Maybe you're a PE teacher, so you do more, admittedly, but golf is very different in as much as, you know, you're coaching 40 hours a week. It's a proper living in that respect. So that's what I was doing. And I was blessed to be able to have the opportunity to spend those thousands of hours coaching. So I got a good grounding in skill acquisition and coaching science and, you know, experiences as a coach. And you're seeing a cross-section of society, many different age groups, individuals, groups, great golfers, beginners, not so good golfers, etc. So you really do have a range of experiences. So I would say the transition was through the prism of coaching, and then I stopped coaching and then became a sports psych. So it was quite, in many respects, I suppose, quite seamless from an experience perspective. It was just really a case of the challenge was going out and getting business, basically. And again, I lent heavily on the golf in as much as I was I was a county coach. So the Surrey County, which is a county in England just south of London and hits the borders of London, we call them, the counties that hit the borders of London are called the home counties. And I was a Surrey County coach. And I just said to the head coach, do you mind if I reposition myself as the sports psych? Is there funding for that? And he said, yeah, no problem. So I was really into it straight away. And I was kind of doing some psych work with clients, with golf coaching clients. And then a member of the golf club I was coaching at had bought a non-league football team. They competed in the 6th division, basically, step 6, as we call it here in England. So, you know, a bit down, but not that far down. And they're very, very good players, 7 of whom went back up into league football the year after the year I was there. Not all down to me, you know, I'm not suggesting that. But it was a very good standard and afforded me the opportunity to learn the language of the game of football, to learn the specific challenges that the players face, which I think is important. Sports psychologists, as I alluded to earlier, can work across sports, but being able to specialize in some sports, I think is quite useful, because every sport has its own unique challenges. Every sport has its own unique language. So I think that's a useful thing to do. So the transition was very much, the golf is there and I know like the back of my hand. So I'm going to keep doing that. Football, I've got this opportunity. And so I worked at non-league level, and then suddenly a Premier League client popped up and it snowballed from there. And I just continued to have the odd client here and there in other sports, and that snowballed as well, and really built from there. So it was kind of, all in all, when I reflect back and answering you here, I reflect back and think, yeah, it was pretty smooth, to be honest with you.
I'm glad to hear. And now as a sports psych, to elaborate a little bit what you said there with the differences between the sports, how does it differ in your job when you're working with a golfer versus a football player?
Yeah, I can obviously state the obvious, can't I? I can say one's an individual sport, one's a team sport, one's a self-paced stick sport. Another one is a group team invasion sports that, it's the pace of the game is governed by other people and not yourself. So two different landscapes there. I think if you speak to a lot of people, they'd say, football psychological, really? How can that be? It's a quick instinctive sport, and that's wrong on quite a few levels. I'll start with, by saying on the pitch it's wrong because that's a misunderstanding of how the brain and the nervous system function. The brain and the nervous system work in milliseconds. Football works in seconds. The brain and the nervous system work in milliseconds. So if you and the audience think about players, their favorite players, their favorite teams competing, you could say this for basketball, you could say this for hockey, you could say this for all kinds of team invasion sports that are quick and instinctive. They're playing, and it takes, let's say, a second to score a goal. It takes a second to complete a pass or whatever movement that they're trying to do, but the brain and the nervous system are working in milliseconds. They're throwing out thoughts and feelings all the time. Thoughts and feelings are emerging all the time, and they make a difference. They distract, they shift attention, they cause players to experience anxiety, drop in motivation, drop in confidence, drop in mood, and so on and so forth. So, it's psychological from a performance perspective, from an individual's perspective. It's a group game, it's a team game. So, but it's very useful to have great interpersonal skills on and off the pitch. In golf, the reality is you pay your entrance fee for whatever tour that you're playing, and you turn up and you can play. You can't play in the big events, as I say. You've got to be able to qualify for a certain standard, but whatever standard you're playing, if you're playing the mini tours, you just pay and you go play. Now, in football, if the team, the head coach, the manager, he or she chooses the team, and you might not be in the team, so you can't play. And that's no small psychological thing. So you've got that group dynamic there as well. The very fact that it's a quick sport means that it plays havoc on your attentional processes. You've got to really take charge of your attentional processes. And, what we know about the human brain is its working memory has limited capacity. Attention is limited. And so that's how so many goals are scored against you is players being distracted or dropping off in attentional intensity, if you like. So that matters. It matters in soccer. It matters in team invasion sports. And in golf, it obviously matters. You're out there on your own. You've got to be your own boss. You've got to take charge of yourself out there. Otherwise, the shot takes charge of you. The hole takes charge of you. The course takes charge of you. That's where it becomes very psychological. So there's differences. There's similarities. And certainly as a psychologist, I'm using some of the same techniques that I'm using in soccer as I am in golf, for example, let's talk about performance here. Self-talk. I think golfers need to use their self-talk. I think footballers need to use their self-talk. Body language, cue words, trigger phrases, good cue, powerful adjectives, alert and alive, dominant and sharp, and words like that can be useful to become a little bit of a mantra. It's something I call a game face, but we go into that if you'd like to. So I certainly use similar techniques across sports. They might be played out in different ways. They might be utilized in different ways, but I think the same sort of basic mental skills are there. I think it's important for elite level sports competitors in golf and football to be able to use mental skills, to be able to manage their well-being and manage ill-being. We can pretty safely say that we want to help coaches have a great environment in both golf and football. Obviously, there's more of a team orientation in football. Coach-athlete relationships matter. Motivation matters. Emotion matters. how a coach coaches, the capacity to be a great teacher, which, has a psychological influence, matters. So there's a lot there, and there's a lot of similarities between the two sports.
I see. And it's safe to say that it's a deep field here, so many aspects that you mentioned now. But focusing on performance, you have said that you have a passion for performance psychology. And I mean, sports is so performance driven.
Yeah, absolutely. Performance with well-being. Performance with well-being. I mean, I always say to coaches, look, for me, I think if we're going to make sense of coaching, there's the 3 Ps of coaching. And, you're getting Dan Abraham's ideas or colloquialisms here that, 3 Ps of coaching would be, for me, participation, progression, and performance. If you're a sports coach, for me, every single sports coach on earth is invested in those 3 Ps. And you could say an under-8 coach isn't so invested in performance. But what you can absolutely guarantee is, let's say, Jurgen Klopp for Liverpool Football Club is absolutely invested in participation. He wants to help players engage in the game, in a healthy and safe manner, healthy and safe environment, stretching them and challenging them. He wants to help them progress their game, so help them develop and improve. And then he wants to help them perform. Clearly, at the adult elite level and the developing elite level, performance is the big buzzword. We want to help players perform, but be able to perform with well-being in mind. I think modern day football and modern day other sports are starting to learn that's really important. So they need to create great environments that allows that to happen. Last thing to say here is we can't ignore the fact that, again, if I go to the adult elite level, so not kids sport, youth sport, but at the adult elite level, organizations are in place to strive to win. Whether it's for the fans, whether it's for the community, to be able to employ people. If a team gets relegated, they lose money. So that's the reality of it. It's just, how do we win? How do we win healthily, safely, while engaging players, while helping players progress as individuals, as teammates, as human beings? That's what I'd say.
Yeah. So is performance the major reason for why teams and players want the sports psychologist in the first place? I'm guessing that if you're the number one in the world in your sport, probably nowadays they also have sports psychologists. But back in the days, maybe the reason why you hired a sports psych in the first place was that you were struggling.
I think that's where it started. And I think that's where sports psychology became burdened by definition. I mean, I think there's a historical context there whereby, psychology, or you see a shrink, you've got a problem, rather than seeing it as helping somebody to thrive, to flourish, to be the best that they can be, to be a stretch rather than a shrink, right? So I think there's that cultural context there. I do think that historically sports psychology has sold the narrative of, we're here to help you perform better. That is changing. It's performance with well-being. So performance, as I've mentioned before, from a healthy and safe perspective for individuals and the group. Again, I think it's balancing out now. I think players are searching for both. I think that organizations are searching for both. I think it's helping players and organizations understand that they work hand in hand. We can look to help optimize your game. We can look to help optimize your progression alongside your performance in a healthy and safe manner. And part of that is that participation piece, is helping players enjoy engaging in their game. As a sports psychologist, you do get a lot of calls from players who are maybe mid-career, whereby they're just not enjoying it anymore. It's not novel anymore. And obviously I'm mindful at the moment that when I'm referring to this, I'm referring to the adult elite level, which is 0.0001%, right? So, I might engage in a youth team, a youth sports player, to help them from a performance perspective, a well-being perspective. But I'm always conscious of, a lot of my work is through coaches. I tend not to try to get involved in young players under the age of 12, because I'd like to be able to think that I'd want to upskill the coach. I potentially want to work with that player's parents first, because if they need a sports psych at 9, 10, 11 years old, it's often because they're not enjoying it because there's pressure coming from certain directions, maybe, outside of them. And that's not to say young people, children, can't put pressure on themselves. It's not always from the external, but it usually is. So I might help a parent. I might help a parent alongside the child. I often work with coaches. So there's a rich landscape there. There's not really one way to do it, but I think it is balancing it out between performance and well-being, or performance with well-being.
You said before when we compared golf with the soccer that how it differs. I guess it's also different when you're dealing with professional athletes versus younger athletes. Like you said now, is it more well-being focused on the younger ages and more performance-driven on the older, or how do you see it?
Yeah, look, I'm going to stick my neck out and say it's both. We just want to create as optimal environment as we possibly can for young and older players. That might start with what we might call in psychology a psychologically informed environment. So I do think it starts with coaching psychology, and that starts maybe with, hey, look, I think it probably starts with self skills. I'm often, when I deliver presentations to coaches or facilitations, I'm often starting with self skills. And by that, I mean self-awareness, self-control, and self-reflection. I think those three important self skills, or those three self skills are important, are vital to help coaches be the best that they can be. And when they're engaged in those kind of reflection skills or self skills, self-awareness, self-control, self-reflection, then they usually have a better coaching practice. They're usually better teachers. They usually help their young players be better learners. And then they usually have a more adaptive, healthier environment. But if I was to go into that environment, I would say it's starting with what we call a PI, a psychologically informed environment. And what a psychologically informed environment is, in very simple terms, is taking account of the thoughts, feelings, emotions, experiences and personalities of players who are in your care. Experiences as in understanding that players have history. They've often come from other clubs, or they've started kicking around a football before. Personalities, experiences, they have different personalities, they have different experiences with different family setups. They have thoughts and feelings and emotions revolving around their football and what it means to them in their lives, different narratives around that, different goals and different values. So that's very important to note. And I think we can probably safely say, and look, there's a great debate about early specialization, and there's great debate around specialization versus diversification. And it's a strong debate, because there's certainly evidence that if a young player wants to be good at sport, then certainly in a sport like soccer, football, actually engaging in soccer very early on, 5, 6, 7 years old, has been demonstrated scientifically to make a difference to progress in later years. Now, that has to be offset against ethical considerations, right? And that's when we talk about the professionalization of youth sport. And I just think we've got to be nimble as sports coaches, as sports organizations. I don't think there's anything wrong with young players being coached and experiencing coaching. I don't think it necessarily just has to be free play, although it would be good if more organizations helped young players just enjoy free play. They don't always have to be coached. Equally, coaching can be good fun, and young players want to be coached. The evidence suggests they want to be coached. They enjoy that, but not in an authoritarian way. Authoritative maybe, where there's some boundaries and rules and a coach is giving guidelines, but not in an authoritarian, shouty way, right? So I think it's a fascinating landscape. And I think then as a sports psychologist, that's, all the things I'm talking about, we're taking evidence from the world of sports psychology and a bit from sports science and a bit from skill acquisition and coaching science, and bringing that together and saying, this is what we know about this landscape. There's no hard rules, probably apart from the ethical piece. Bullying, no. A little bit of coaching here, yeah. For 6, 7, 8-year-olds, why not? Bit of, some diversification, fantastic. But doing fencing at 8 isn't going to help you. The evidence doesn't suggest it helps you doing football. Even doing a sport like rugby doesn't necessarily demonstrate scientifically that there's crossover into football. But I would like my child to experience a healthy environment where he or she is experiencing all sports, there's the ethical consideration. So that's what I think, that's how we can contribute, by introducing these things to players, to coaches, to parents, by having these challenging conversations, and by probably saying, at 8 years old, we probably shouldn't be having conversations around talent, elite, too much specialization or specialization in general. And I probably shouldn't be sitting down with an 8-year-old as a sports psychologist, because that 8-year-old is anxious. There's something wrong there environmentally. That's what I'd say.
I see. That's a very interesting take on it, because I have always been fed the information that you should do as many sports as possible up until the highest age possible, and that will benefit you in the sport that you later chooses to specialize in. But you say that that's not necessarily true.
Wow. Now, what I'd say to you is I don't have exhaustive knowledge of the research literature, but I certainly, someone I had on my own podcast who I'd thoroughly recommend speaking to, Professor Mark Williams, who's University of Utah. He's one of the most experienced sports scientists out there, and he's done a lot of work in this area. And he would say that I think it would come under the label of donor sports, that there's not necessarily transference of skills from one sport to another sport. Obviously, it depends on what sports you're talking about. However, by and large, it's got to look like the game.
Yeah.
The more it looks like the game, the more whatever you're doing looks like soccer, the more chance you've got, let's say, I can see how basketball, visual exploratory behaviors can transfer from basketball to football.
Yeah.
But you've also got a small court. You've got, so it's not fully representative. You've got fewer players. You're using your hands. You're looking at different things. You have to bear in mind that the science is looking at that and saying, oh, yeah, not so much. However, Marcus, from an ethical consideration, and if we think about how we'd want our young people to develop, if you'd want your child to experience lots of different sports, I think that's important. I certainly wouldn't agree. I've had parents say to me, I want my child to just practice golf. My child is going and playing in the under-6 World Golf Championship, and the moment he does golf and, he should specialize. And when I question that, I sort of get the response of, well, that's where there's a difficulty because, Tiger Woods and blah, 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 blah. And it's like, that's a parental decision. And that you can make that decision, but I'm not too sure that's so healthy. So I think for the health of the child, that's vital. So that's what I would say there. But look, you would get a far more comprehensive answer around the science from someone like Professor Mark Williams. That's
usually my last question. Who you think that I should talk to next? But we covered that already here. So
well, we can mention somebody else.
No, that's fine. That sounds very interesting. Mark Williams. So, I find it very interesting also what we said before about what I believe that you call that you want to demystify sports psychology. Is that what we talked about before, that we said that initially maybe sports psychologists were hired when there was an issue and not to prevent issues maybe?
Yeah, I'd say that's almost a related but slightly separate topic. I always say on these podcasts that, I ask yourself as a host and the audience to picture a continuum. And on the right-hand side of that continuum, let's say we've got the psychological theorists and researchers who might at times be a little guilty of talking about, not all, I'm not broad brush statement here, but who might talk about inverted U hypothesis and systematic desensitization, and players are kind of looking and going, hey man, I just want to score some goals and keep some clean sheets, I'm not too sure what you're talking about. So there's that, there's the let's call it the science. And then maybe if we go to the other side of the continuum, we've got maybe the motivational gurus who, punch the air and say you can achieve anything, and that's fun and great, and it absolutely has its place. It absolutely does. And my passion is to try to hit the middle ground. It's absolutely not to ignore the science, not to ignore the research, the theories, but it is about, for me, simplifying as best you can, an Occam's razor type approach. Simple, but no simpler. Because if you get too simple, you ruin the theory or the research. I do think you've got to try where you can to scaffold down the language. And I think we need to be better at that, because if we direct people to research papers, they're really tough to get through. And as I say, I'm going to come back to the motivational gurus. Ultimately, there are things that they do and things that they say that have credibility. If you go to somebody like Anthony Robbins, I mean, since the mid-'80s, he's been talking about body language. I mean, he uses the term physiology, and I'm not too sure that that's the right term, because that's alongside of biology, that's a term in and of itself. But, he's been talking about the external influencing the internal, or the body influencing the mind, since the mid-'80s. And I'm not saying he coined that or came up with that. I'm just saying he's promoted that. And whether it's under the rubric of embodied cognition, or whether we go on YouTube and watch a TED Talk, Amy Cuddy, Professor Amy Cuddy from Harvard University, talking about her work in power posing, which she got a lot of stick for, but she's now starting to create research papers that have demonstrated some strong results in this area, how the body impacts the mind. We're starting to demonstrate that some of the stuff that these motivational gurus are talking about actually have credible science underpinning them. And so we can't ignore that. And so I do think we have to have grounded language. I, as a practitioner, am passionate about bringing in the subject matter of sports psychology alive, certainly with mental skills, the mental skills side of it, with fun techniques. So rather than self-efficacy, I talk about game face, which very much revolves around confidence. Rather than self-regulation, I talk about using controllers. And that originally came to mind because I was trying to teach footballers a way to really not understand self-regulation, because of course they understand self-regulation, but enjoy it, get to know it, become acquainted with it, and really get passionate about it. And broad brush, deeply unfair statement here, having a little bit of fun at their expense, I would say that by and large in the English Premier League, my experience has been a lot of players will train for a couple of hours in the morning, have lunch, go home and play on a PlayStation for 4 or 5 hours. And so what are they using when they're playing on a PlayStation? They're using a controller. And so I used that as a metaphor for taking control of yourself. When you have controllers, like, say, self-talk when you walk onto the pitch. So game face. Controller, squashing ants being an acronym for automatic negative thoughts. So when I talk about demystifying, I think I'm more targeting not abusing the theory, not abusing the science, but making it fun, making it accessible, making it practical, making it possible. That to me is demystifying sports psychology, at least from a performance perspective.
And with that in mind, if you need to, we have talked about so many different parts of the sports psychology here. If you need to say why sports psychology is so important, or what is the most important part with the sports psychology?
Well, look, I think it's really important because it's always happening. Again, if we were to dig into the history of the delivery of psychology within coaching, I can certainly say here in England in football, the English FA, and it's absolutely not saying anything against them because I understand why they have this model. They have something called a 4-corner model. And coaches over here talk about the psychological corner, the physical corner, the tactical corner. And I don't think you can put psychology into a corner or social into a corner. To me, I think they come paired. Psychosocial. I think the psychosocial component underpins and drives and gets driven by the technical, tactical, and physical components. I would ask the audience to picture, I call it my psychosocial coaching model, or model of coaching. So I'd ask them to picture that psychosocial box at the bottom of the screen, arrows going up and back down, up to technical, tactical, and physical components, so 3 separate boxes. And then above those, participation, 3 boxes: participation, progression, performance. So back to our 3 Ps. And I ask people to picture that because I say to coaches and to players, but to coaches, psychosocial is always happening. It's always there. Every single session, a second of your session, every single second of an activity. It's there when people leave, your session and go home, and they carry your sessions with them. It's there every single day. You know, the brain is constantly processing, configuring, reconfiguring. You know, it's banging away, banging a drum beat underneath everything. You know, whether that's we've got a narrative in our mind about what's going on in our lives, or whether it's just working at a subconscious level without sounding too funky. So I would say, you know, psychosocial is always happening, and you've got to pay attention to that fact. You've got to pay, as a coach, you've got to pay attention to that fact. Your players, psychosocial is always happening. You can't just put it in a corner. So relationships are always happening. Teamship is always happening. Leadership is always happening. Motivation is always happening. Emotion is always happening. Mental skills are always happening. I'd like to say that, you know, thoughts and feelings are always happening. Teaching processes like observation and communication is always happening. So it's always there. And I always say to coaches that that's where you've got to be, in my opinion. I think you've got to be an expert in more than the X's and the O's. Doesn't mean that the X's and O's aren't important. Doesn't mean tap physical isn't important or aren't important, but they're underpinned by psychosocial. Be a coach of people. Be a coach of people so you can be a great coach of the technical, tactical, and physical components.
If we are moving the focus a little bit to you and what you do, you wear many hats, so to speak. You're an author. You mentioned before you have written books. You're a blogger. You have your own podcast, the Sport Psych Show. If we start just on the books, what books have you written? What are they about? And if someone wants to buy them, where do they buy them?
Well, certainly written about all the things that we've spoken about. I sat down in 2012, I think it was. I'd just written an ebook, which you can still, if you pop onto my website, danabrahams.com, you can download that for free.
Yeah, got this one.
Yeah, and then I sat down, I thought, oh, you know, I enjoyed that, and people seemed to like it. So I thought, okay, I'm reasonable at writing. I'm not J.K. Rowling, but I can write. So I sat down to write my first book, Soccer Tough, and I just wanted, again, I'm going to come back to this demystifying. And I took a leaf out of Bob Bratella's book, because I was fortunate to have a few clients who said, oh, you're writing a book, please write about our story. So I wrote about, you know, ethically, with his permission, a player called Carlton Cole and how he went from West Ham reserve team player to England international. And I wrote about other players. I won't go through who they were, but just to bring it alive as much as I could. So that Soccer Tough came out in 2012. That was followed by, so that was for players. I wrote that for players. I wanted players. To golfers, you can go on Amazon, in 1,000 titles come up. For football, there's none. You know, all for coaches, and not many of those. So I wanted players to go on Amazon and go, yeah, I can have that one. But coaches pick it up, you know, and other, you know, coaches and players in other sports, particularly basketball, have picked that up globally. And I'm proud to say it was best-selling globally as well. And then in 2013, I wrote Soccer Brain, which was for coaches only, very much about the cultural piece of coaching. 2015, I wrote, now I'm trying to think here. I think I get a bit confused. I can't remember which way around it was, but I think it was Soccer Tough 2 I wrote first, which, as the name suggests, is the sequel to Soccer Tough, and that was more advanced techniques. And then in 2016, I wrote Golf Tough, so my first golf book. And it was, you know, so I wrote 4 books in 4 years. And then some big consultancy positions came along, and I decided I needed a bit of a break from the writing. I was consulting as I was writing them, but some big positions came along that really took a lot of time and attention away. And that's been quite the same since then, really. But I continue to write. I write a post every day on LinkedIn that I also share on Facebook. I do social media all the time, and I love being able to scaffold down the stuff to 240 characters, whatever it is. And LinkedIn, the short post, requires a discipline as well, because that's only 1,300 characters. I do the odd blog post, and then I've got my podcast, the Sport Psych Show, and obviously I'm consulting all the time as well. So yeah, it keeps me busy and out of trouble, Marcus.
That's good to hear. In these times that we are living in now, regarding the pandemic, how has that affected your job? And I mean, This must be very tough for players and coaches on, their well-being and psychology and worrying about the future, etc.
It's a great question. It's a challenging time, Marcus, as we know. Nothing revelatory about that. As I always say to this question at the moment, I think the first thing, being a big Twitter fan and doing a lot of tweets myself, there are those people out there who talk about if you haven't come out of lockdown having learned a second language, having learned Mandarin and haven't written your autobiography, then you're a loser, man. What have you been doing? I'm not into that, I have to say. I think the first thing to say is giving yourself space for vulnerability. This is a time of uncertainty. And when you're in an uncertain situation, that turns up the volume of, it's a horrible term, but I'm going to use it, neuroticism, which is the psychological term within personality science for negative emotion. So we experience anxiety, maybe some hostility, vulnerability, stress, etc. And I think that's okay. We're allowed to experience that and feel some of those sensations that we will experience through our body. That's okay. We have to allow that and find ways to deal with some of those sensations and urges. And if there is opportunity with that in mind, it is perhaps the opportunity where some people wouldn't necessarily have picked up a psychological book, a mindfulness book, a book that introduces psychological techniques. Now's quite a good time, because if you are going to experience that bit of stress, vulnerability, anxiety, etc., then utilizing psychological techniques can be quite useful. So I would say engage in those, and that might be as simple or maybe even challenging as turning down a volume of your extreme language. This is a disaster. This is the end of the world. So this isn't a nice time. Absolutely. From there's nothing I can do to, well, what can I control here? What can I control? What things can I do? What can I control here? This isn't nice. What is nice within this? What opportunities are there? So being able to, I suppose, use psychological techniques to direct your attention. That's quite important. Perhaps away from the extreme thoughts, extreme language, the narrative around extremes towards slightly more rational language, and paying attention to what you do have and what opportunities there are, even if those opportunities are so slim and you've got to go searching for those. It's a time when you can start taking charge of your brain rather than your brain taking charge of you, without me being too punch the air and going, well, you've got to do that from the off. No, human beings don't function that way, but we can learn ways to manage ourselves during tough times.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
That's good advice. We have talked for quite some time here, but I feel like we have just scratched the surface on sports psychology. But is it something that I haven't asked you that you feel is important to bring up?
Oh, good question. Oh, wow. No, I look, as you say, we could talk about so many things. I can't think of anything that comes to mind. You've asked me about, great guests. So whether it's Professor Mark Williams, I think wonderful person is Dr. Pippa Grange, who was the psychologist for the England football team who got to the semi-final of the World Cup. She's moved on and she's working for a wonderful charity and driving participation in women's football globally now, and for women's sport, I think I should accurately say. So I think Dr. Pippa Grange would be a wonderful guest for you. And
more importantly, she was on your podcast here recently.
Absolutely. And as we speak today, I've released her podcast there, and I thoroughly recommend getting on her on. She has some fantastic ideas and a brilliant person. So that's the last thing I'd add.
Thank you so much for taking your time to be on the Sports Management podcast. And to everyone listening, check out danabrams.com. Download the free ebook there. It's very interesting. And also listen to the Sport Psych Show.
Marcus, thank you so much for having me on. It's been an honor and a pleasure. Fantastic questions. Really enjoyed it. And I look forward to speaking again soon.
Thank you for listening to Sports Management Podcast. Do you have thoughts or ideas about this podcast, or do you know someone that I should interview next? please reach out to me on sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or visit my website sportsmanagementpodcast.com. If you prefer social media, you can find me on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram at sportsmpodcast.